Welcome to the Washington State Legislative Internship History Podcast. It's quite a mouthful, but we're doing something fun here, so I'm really happy you were able to join. Um, so if you wouldn't mind filling everybody in, just saying your credentials and what you're doing over there at UW.
Well, okay. So my name is Ross Coen, and I'm a instructor in the history department at University of Washington, Seattle. I got my PhD from UW, 4 years ago now. And so since then, I've been teaching a number of undergraduate classes, among them history of Washington State and the Pacific Northwest. My research focuses primarily on political, social, and environmental history of the American West, the Pacific Northwest, Alaska. I lived in Alaska for 20 some years, and so a lot of my research is based there. Um, but generally, I research political and social and environmental history of our part of the world.
And we couldn't have found a better person to come on this show. So thank you so much for being here.
Very welcome.
So what we're hoping to talk about today is sort of the economic and political change that came with the just absolute uh, reinvention of our industrial and economic sectors over kind of the last half of the 20th century. So if you were to look at the economy and industry of Washington before World War II, what was keeping the economy running? What were the major employers in the state, and what did life look like from a industrial and economic standpoint before the war?
Yeah, yeah. Good question. So prior to World War II, we can actually go all the way back to the arrival of the first Europeans and
Really?
Americans in the Pacific Northwest in the 18th century, all the way back to, George Vancouver and the first, American mountain men coming over the Rocky Mountains and all the rest. And the economy, really from that start of Euro-American colonization all the way up into the 20th century was almost entirely resource development. So the first big resource boom in the what was then called the Northwest Coast. The Pacific Northwest is kind of a funny term, right? It only the Pacific Northwest as a geographic designation only makes sense with regard to the seat of government and finance back on the East Coast, New York, Washington, D.C., and so forth. So in this era, then the late 18th century, this part of the world was called the Northwest Coast. And the first big resource boom in this area then at that time was furs. It was sea
Hmm.
otters and then land-based fur-bearing mammals, especially beaver. And so the fur trade is the thing that really draws the first Europeans and Americans to this part of the world. And then throughout the 19th century, as more and more American settlers arrive, the economy diversifies a little bit, but again, it's still based almost entirely on resource development. So you have commercial salmon fishing, mining, and especially logging, right? Because with the discovery of gold in California in the 1840s and 1850s, there's an economic boom in California that requires resources, that requires materials, especially timber. And
Hmm.
so in the early years of San Francisco, the gold rush in the 1840s and 50s, much of that timber is being supplied by local forests. Well, as the decades go on, San Francisco becomes sort of this maelstrom that just is ever expanding in its harvest of resources from outside. And so the Washington timber industry begins to really take off in the 1870s, 1880s, supplying timber to San Francisco and to other parts of the country and the world as well. And then the completion of the transcontinental railroads reaching the Washington territory in the 1880s and 90s,
Hmm.
first Tacoma and then Seattle, provides ready transportation networks for the movement of logs. And that's when the timber industry really takes off.
Hmm.
So, Luke, this is sort of a long roundabout way of answering your question. But when we think about the economy in the Northwest Coast, and then the Oregon Territory, and then the Washington Territory, and then Washington State, all the way up into the
Hmm.
20th century, it's almost entirely the harvest of natural resources.
Absolutely. And you look at there are points along that timeline where you can see the way that state legislation is going hand in hand with that economic development. You talk about the railroads, and you can look at the role that the state legislature had in bringing those railroads in and making decisions about where the terminuses would lie. This resource extraction was very much the name of the game at the time. Would you agree?
Very much so.
Very
And
much so.
we can also look at, state regulation of fisheries, mostly salmon fisheries, but also other fisheries as well. And so the state, especially when Washington is a territory prior to 1889, all fisheries management is conducted by the federal government. That being
Hmm.
said, there's actually very little fisheries management by the federal government,
Hmm.
simply because the federal government was not in a position either in terms of scientific expertise or manpower to be able to really regulate fisheries in any way. But then the state of Washington assumes management of resources, including fish. And so we see how the state government in the early decades of the 20th century is again attempting to facilitate the development of this resource. There are attempts at conservation of fisheries,
Hmm.
as well as conservation of timber resources, in terms of like establishing national forests and parks and
Hmm.
all the rest. But to your point, the state is heavily involved in the management and regulation of those industries for economic growth.
And so as the depression wanes and there is this sort of realization that as America goes into World War II, there's going to be not just an industrial boom, but just a genuine shift in the way that industry is conducted across the nation. To the extent that the state government had been facilitating all of these other extractive industries before, what happens either at a state or federal level that brings the industry of World War II to Washington State?
Mhm. It is mostly federal in this era. One of the sort of curiosities about land ownership in the West, it was true then and it's true today, is that the federal government was and remains the largest landowner in many Western states. And
Totally.
so a lot of these projects that we're talking about in the run up to wartime production, things like the dams on the Columbia River and so forth,
Hmm.
are largely federal in nature because they're happening on federal
Of
land.
course. With
Um,
this New Deal and all of that
mhm,
coming with a huge sweep across the state. Yeah,
right.
so I'm curious, how did Washington get picked out for those federal projects? And specifically, which of those federal projects created new cities? You look at places like Tri-City or Cooley. How did that
Right.
happen?
I mean, World War II is a major transformational moment, and I want to talk about that with you, but let's not skip past the Great Depression, right? Because
Totally, yeah.
the with the Franklin Delano Roosevelt and New Deal programs, one
Hmm.
of which is the Civilian Conservation Corps. It's an effort to take all of the unemployed young men in the country and put them to work, in large part in the nation's forests,
Hmm.
managing forests, building watchtowers for fires, planting
Hmm.
trees. Well, of course, here in Washington State, in the Pacific Northwest, we are abundant in forests in need of
Hmm.
management and fire protection and all the rest. And so the federal government, under the Civilian Conservation Corps, has a very large presence in Washington, putting men to work in the
Hmm.
forest of the state. And then also the construction of the dams, starting really with the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River. It's in part it's a make work project, right? It's the
Hmm.
federal government making a significant investment that the private sector was never going to be able to make, in order simply to put people to work, give people
Hmm.
jobs, with the understanding that once unemployed laborers are working building these dams, they're going to have money in their pockets, which they're going to spend at the grocery store and at the bowling alley and at the diner down the street and all the rest.
Hmm.
So every dollar of federal money that's invested in the building of the dam is going to roll over multiple times, expanding the economic growth in the communities more broadly. So yes, it's a make work project, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't also have some utility. The
Absolutely.
central goals, plural, of the Grand Coulee and other dams, first to generate electrical power, cheap hydroelectricity that could be used in the manufacturing sector, but then
Hmm.
also to manage water resources in the arid part, eastern half of the state, basically
Hmm.
turn the deserts of eastern Washington into productive farmland. So so that's the sort of the rationale behind the dams. Um, and then, of course, when the United States enters World War II, and there's this incredible demand for wartime production, airplanes, ships, all the rest, Washington State is now uniquely positioned to contribute to that war effort because of the incredible amounts of hydroelectricity that are coming out of the Bonneville Power Administration. And then this leads us into aluminum smelting and Kaiser shipyards in Portland, Oregon, Vancouver, Washington, producing hundreds of ships over the course of the war. It gives rise to Boeing producing airplanes, and now we're off and running.
Hmm. So you touch on a great catalyst point in the history of kind of the state's growth right there, where, these different points of industry land in very opportune places. And, the Kaiser shipyards is a great example of the entire city of Vancouver, Washington, essentially grows out of this one shipyard. Um, the Bonneville Power Administration brings so many people to the eastern half of the state in a way that plants the seeds for cities that are entire legislative districts in and of themselves now. Um,
Right.
can you talk a little bit about clearly Boeing in Seattle is one example of a company that grew a town. Can you talk a little bit about what Boeing did for Seattle and maybe a couple other towns in the state that grew out of that wartime industry?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Boeing becomes the largest private employer in Washington State in World War II. And then that continues into the early years of the Cold
Hmm.
War. Um, and let's not overlook too the changes in the racial and ethnic demographics of the state.
Totally.
In prior to World War II, Washington's population was overwhelmingly white with native peoples who, of
Hmm.
course, had lived here for thousands of years, and very few other racial or ethnic minorities. But this wartime production, the Kaiser shipyards, Boeing, Hanford Engineer Works, which is another
Hmm.
one we can talk about, the labor force that's required for that begins to draw from other parts of the country, particularly as so many young men who might be filling those jobs are off on the battlefront in Europe
Hmm.
and Pacific theater. And so you have African Americans begin migrating to the Pacific Northwest in significant numbers for the first
Hmm.
time. Prior to World War II, the number of African Americans in the entire state was, I think, about 6 or 7 thousand, with about half of those in Seattle.
Hmm.
And Portland was only maybe 1,000 prior to World War II. Well, by 1944, 45, the height of the wartime production, those numbers had quadrupled. And they would fall a little bit after the war as those military contracts were canceled by the federal
Hmm.
government. But nevertheless, you have a significant growth in the Black population of
Hmm.
Seattle and Washington State. Latino population begins to arrive, particularly to fill the agricultural jobs in places like Yakima,
Hmm.
again, desperately in need of workers. And so the population demographics of Washington change with the corresponding then changes to political institutions.
Hmm.
So, for example, The NAACP becomes very active in Seattle in the 1940s, particularly with the arrival of so many Black residents.
Hmm.
And this leads to Charles Stokes, an African American attorney from Seattle, elected to the state legislature in 1950, the first Black legislator from Seattle. You have the state legislature enacting a fair employment law in 1949, which was designed to end workplace discrimination, particularly in places like Boeing and Hanford, where workers lived in segregated housing and had
Hmm.
segregated lunchrooms and all the rest. Um, so you can really sort of see, Luke, how like one change leads to another, an economic
Absolutely.
change leads to a population change, leads to a political change, and then this just continues sort of roiling in the World War II and the post-war era.
Absolutely. And so as we come out of the immediate industrialization of the state during the war, um, you have, well, firstly, you have the Hanford Engineer Works, which should not overlook both during the war and after. Do you want to touch on that briefly? I feel like that's such an important note to people coming in and learning about the legislative process here and the responsibilities that it has.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, Hanford selected as a site by the federal government, the Atomic Energy Commission, excuse me, for the availability of hydroelectricity, the power that's generated to refine plutonium.
Hmm.
And then also, the site of Hanford itself is selected because there was relatively, few people there. I mean, if the government
Hmm.
is going to build this secret nuclear processing facility, the government is going to want to put it somewhere that's relatively isolated. This is how we
Hmm.
end up with, the development of the atomic bomb in New Mexico,
Hmm.
right? And you end up with Hanford being established in rural Washington State.
Hmm.
Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is where uranium was refined, is selected again because of the availability of hydropower from the Tennessee Valley Authority.
Hmm.
So all of that is to say then that the selection of Hanford as a site in Washington took advantage of those logistical advantages for the
Mm.
production of
Yeah.
plutonium. And then exerts again another influence on the population and the politics of the state itself.
Hmm. The the growth of the Tri-Cities coming out of that is a huge point of um interest and expansion on sort of that state timeline. And
Right.
with it's interesting, we have the continued legacy of that shaking out in the this current legislative session. Um, so it's incredibly important to note that on the sort of timeline here. And then,
Yeah,
going
and
back to, oh, go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry, I was just going to say it's fascinating, isn't it, that
It
today
really is.
Hanford is still an economic driver of the region and the state, except now you have more people employed and more financial investment for environmental cleanup and remediation
Exactly.
than for the production of plutonium, which was its original design. Hanford has sort of taken on a new life and is yet still an economic driver for the region and the state.
Absolutely. And, talking about Hanford is obviously a more ironic example, but I think, talking about continuation of the economic growth as you transition out of the post-war era, it's very interesting to look at the gambit that Boeing tried to run in that regard, with transitioning into Cold War contracting as well as trying to get their civilian sector off the ground. Um, the uh, the civilian side of that and becoming a company that sustains itself off of private and commercial aviation is not an easy thing to do. Do you have any insight on how they were able to do that in in both in the area and in the market?
Yeah, Boeing has undergone some of these transformations over the same era. in line with military needs, with federal policy, and so forth. So yes, so Boeing in World War II booms the production of aircraft for World War II, and then the transition into the Cold War. It's not seamless exactly, and of
Hmm.
course Boeing, the from a high of wartime employment in the 1940s, it declines a little bit at the end of the war, but then employment numbers begin to rise again in the 1950s as Boeing proves very successful in securing federal contracts for airplanes and rocketry and things for the Cold War. And then
Hmm.
it uses that largesse then to, as you mentioned, begin designing and marketing civilian aircraft. So you
Hmm.
don't have, the 737 and the 747. You don't get those in the 1960s without Boeing's success as a military contractor for the U.S. military, also for NASA. And
Hmm.
so the civilian and the military developments sort of go hand in hand in this era as Boeing continues to rise. And you see this reflected in terms of the 2-year congressional budget cycles. So
Hmm.
on the federal level, every 2 years, a new Congress comes into office and passes a federal budget. Sometimes that budget goes up, sometimes it goes down. And throughout the 1960s, you can sort of track employment numbers at Boeing. They'll tick up a little bit in one particular year from federal contracts, but then a new Congress passes a budget that cuts military funding, and then employment numbers at Boeing dip a little bit, and
Hmm.
2 years later they go up, and then 2 years later they come down. So throughout the 1960s, it's very easy to track Boeing production, employment numbers in tandem with that federal budget cycle.
That's so interesting.
And Luke, the other thing that we should not overlook here is the how the politics on the state and the federal level behind all of these things, right? Now,
Absolutely.
let me back up to the early 1900s. The early 1900s is a time of radical politics, not just in the Pacific Northwest, but around the country. You have
Hmm.
farmers' revolts, the establishment of the Populist Party in the 1890s, very much an effort to resist corporatization of agriculture, the banking industry, governments, railroads. Here in the Northwest, socialist parties begin to emerge. You have labor, especially the IWW, International Workers of the World, becomes a powerful force for a time, at least, in terms of protesting the corporatization of, the mining industries, logging, and all the rest. So all of that is to say that the Pacific Northwest is a very fertile ground in the early decades of the 20th century for radical politics. Okay. By the 1930s, you have New Deal Democrats, people like Warren Magnuson and Henry Scoop Jackson entering public office, again seeking those federal contracts for the building of the dam and federal investment in the state. Washingtonians are very supportive of this wartime manufacturing in the 1940s and 50s that we've talked about. And
Hmm.
so the point that I'm driving at here then is that by the Cold War era, Washington has two of the most powerful members of the United States Senate, Jackson and Magnuson, both Democrats, both progressive on certain issues, especially social issues,
Hmm.
and yet Cold War hawks
Hmm.
that are ruthlessly supportive and effective at these military contracts and the
Hmm.
participation of Washington in the Cold War. So it's such an interesting sort of political dynamic that emerges in this era where Washington as a whole tends to be democratic, tends to be progressive, particularly on social issues, as many urban centers in the West are. And yet at the same time, Washington is as a state, very hawkish
Hmm.
because so many of the federal dollars coming into the state are a result of military and Cold War production. It's a very interesting,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And it's kind of one of the last chapters in this, if you look at the 20th century up to kind of the mid 60s through the late 70s, at the beginning of the 20th century, you had all of this resource extraction that the state was pumping money and time and legislation into. And then clearly this massive industrial streak through the mid-century. And then you get to the 60s and 70s, and Lake Washington is sudsing because there's so many industrial waste byproducts in it. And 70% of our old growth forests have been clear cut. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the sort of attitudes and remedies that kind of came about during the 60s and 70s in reaction to this extreme extraction of resources and pollution of industry.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think in many respects, Washington is sort of emblematic of some of these trends that are playing out nationally with the rise of the modern environmental movement, a recognition of the hazards posed by sort of this runaway industrialization, nuclear power, the chemical industry, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring pointing out the
Absolutely.
devastating effects of DDT, and Washingtonians, generally speaking, I don't want to overgeneralize here, but
Hmm.
generally speaking, Washingtonians have prided themselves on an environmental ethos, sort of
Hmm.
running hand in hand with the natural splendor of the state in which we live, clean air, clean water, the forests, and so on and so forth. And so the reform movements that emerge in this era are sort of grounded in that environmental ethos and an acknowledgement, as you said, that growth for growth's sake may not be the wisest, course in terms of quality of life.
Hmm.
It's very interesting. We can look at a couple of different sort of signposts here in this debate. Think about the 1962 World's Fair in Seattle.
Hmm.
It was space, it was science, it was technology, it was rockets and airplanes, and sort of looking ahead to the year 2000
Hmm.
and how science and technology was going to enrich our lives, right?
Right.
And then just more than a decade later, Spokane hosts its own World's Fair, and the theme of that World's Fair was all about environmental conservation and preserving the air and the water. And so it's a little too neat of a metaphor. I don't mean to
Hmm.
oversimplify it, but you can go sort of from one World's Fair to the next, only 12 years apart,
Totally.
and see that Washingtonians' thinking had changed in terms of the role that science and technology plays in our lives, and how maybe that science and technology needs to be mitigated somewhat to preserve our quality of life.
Absolutely. And for more on this, for listeners of the Washington State Legislative Internship History podcast, my great friend Tommy DeVoe is going to be doing an episode next week focusing on each of the expositions and World's Fairs throughout the state and kind of the chronology of the state that went with each of them. So
Wonderful.
that's going to be a great episode. And thank you for teasing it.
All right.
Um, so, we sort of come out of the slowdown and um, conservation of the 70s and through an economic boom in the 80s that just sort of smooths things out from the malaise of the 70s and puts things back on track a little bit. So, where is Seattle in its sort of grunge heyday, and what is coming to the state of Washington from an industrial and cultural standpoint as we're looking down the barrel of the dot-com boom here?
Yeah, yeah. It's we see another transition happening here. We went from sort of
Hmm.
resource development in the early period to manufacturing, to a focus on manufacturing in World War II and the Cold War. And you're
Hmm.
right, by the 70s and 80s and 90s, now the transition to tech is coming along.
Hmm.
And I think you can sort of draw a line, a straight line in many ways between those eras in that the growth of resource development depended on technological innovation, building of railroads, improved
Hmm.
methods for cutting and moving trees, producing lumber, the harvest of fish, things like that, into wartime manufacturing. Again, sort of the triumph of science and technology in terms of
Hmm.
smelting aluminum and so on and so forth, up into the 1962 World's Fair with this focus on science and technology and innovation. And then that leads in many ways straight into the tech era, Microsoft and all the rest.
Hmm.
It's of course different in its form and content, but
Hmm.
it's still an economic innovation that depends on this application of science and engineering,
Hmm.
for which Washington was uniquely positioned given this
Hmm.
long history. Um, and then it again is exerting an influence on population dynamics and the politics of the era. So
Hmm.
particularly with the rise of tech, more and more workers are coming from abroad, right? A
Hmm.
significant immigrant workforce, particularly in the
Hmm.
tech industry from India and China and other countries, again marking that shift in the population dynamics of the state.
And very interestingly, also the political dynamics of the state. You have a huge portion of people coming from California, and you have a huge portion of people coming from Southeast Asia, all of
Mhm.
which are places where the politics are both very present in people's lives. The political is personal, and a lot of times very community focused and equality focused. And you can really see that being a factor that has greatly influenced the both the state at large, but especially the Seattle metropolitan area as it's grown and grown and grown. Um, do you see the influx of tech as having made a how do I want to ask this question? Because it's such a broad topic, but the tech influx into Seattle had a huge impact on the way we legislate corporations and the policy choices we make about land use, etc. See do you see any changes in both the economy and the political sphere coming from this tech boom that we're far enough away from that you can kind of look at the 2000s and 2010s and actually have any retrospective historian opinions on them? And are there any trends that are evident enough as a historian that you sort of have any predictions about where our industrial momentum is headed?
Mhm. Well,
That was a very wordy question, but
that's all right. That's all right.
please.
Historians are always loath to try to predict the future, right?
I know.
That's not our strong suit for sure. I don't know
You
where
love the confidence of what's already happened.
let me come at your question from this way, and this is something
Please.
that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Is um, some of the listeners to this podcast may be aware of Forward Thrust. It was a series of bond proposals, bond measures back in the 1960s. It was an effort by certain civic leaders to plan for the growth in Seattle and King County that they saw was going to be coming in future decades.
Hmm.
And so things like the King Dome, for example, the King Dome was
Hmm.
started as a forward thrust project where voters went to the polls and they voted on bonds in order to raise the money for these types
Hmm.
of projects, right? Well, part of forward thrust, a significant part, was about transportation,
Hmm.
long-term transportation plan to widen the I-5 corridor, to
Hmm.
improve busing,
Hmm.
bus system, also to develop some form of rail links, right?
Hmm.
Something along the lines of sort of the monorail that, when it was developed in 1962 for the World's Fair, was actually seen as a long-term transportation option for the county. It didn't quite work out that
Hmm.
way. And today the monorail is sort of a historical relic. Nevertheless,
Hmm.
so Forward Thrust was really thinking, how are we going to plan for the growth of Seattle and King County over the next several decades in terms of transportation, moving people around?
Hmm.
When voters went to the polls in the 60s on a series of Forward Thrust proposals, they tended to approve things like the Kingdome and other public infrastructure projects. The transportation projects did not fare as well, and many of those were voted down.
Hmm.
Now, what that means in certain respects, it makes sense. You're asking voters to pay more in taxes for a transportation system that they probably will not benefit from or even see for another decade or more. And that's always a
Hmm.
tough sell at the poll.
Absolutely.
Well, we can look back as historians from our present perch and see how the transportation difficulties that we're still struggling with today in terms of a crowded I-5 corridor,
Hmm.
establishing bus service to the entire county, um, the construction of the light rail system.
Hmm.
These were challenges that we're facing now, challenges that we faced then, and had things worked out differently in terms of Forward Thrust in the 1960s, we might be in a very different position today with
Hmm.
regard to light rail and the I-5 corridor and all the rest.
Hmm.
I'm not casting blame here, and I'm not suggesting that the defeat of those bond measures in the 1960s was a mistake. I'm not saying that by
Hmm.
any means. Simply that as historians, we can sort of look back and see here's how the past played out, and here is how we got here in the present from there. And
Absolutely.
the challenges that we're talking about today in terms of transportation are in
Hmm.
many ways the same discussions that we were having 50 and 60 years ago. Just
Absolutely.
something to keep in mind as we talk about public policy.
Absolutely. And, depending on if you're an intern listening to this podcast or anybody in the legislative staff who has been lucky enough to find our channel, as we move into the next legislative session, in the longer half of the biennium here, we will be dealing with a slew of significant transportation questions. And so this is one of those perfect instances of figuring out how we got here. The Federal Railway Administration is working on a corridor ID program between these next two legislative sessions that will determine the next set of decisions to be made about transportation in the state and along the I-5 corridor. So these are historical issues, but they are also extremely prescient. And I think this type of context on any of these issues is crucial to move forward making decisions about them. So I thank you so much for your time, Dr. Cohen. It's
Very
always a
welcome, Luke.
pleasure to chat with you. Um,
Good to see you.
I look forward to sharing this with everybody here at the legislature and um, talking to you soon. This was fantastic. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.